Here we are on a beautiful September morning, nice and calm. It's going to be a hot one, but right now it's still nice. And we are with Dr. John Taylor of the Department of Plant Science and Entomology. So, John, tell us what this trellis here we're standing in.
Okay, so I'm interested in urban agriculture. I did my PhD on urban agriculture in Chicago, and so I'm really interested in small-scale intensive systems that are appropriate for urban sites, which tend to be small. Like space is a real constraint in urban agriculture. And one thing that I noticed, I did work for my PhD with Chinese origin gardeners in Chicago, and I noticed that they were growing vining crops, often very culturally specific crops like bitter melon, on arbors, and underneath those arbors and underneath those vining crops they were growing leafy crops. The idea being that the vining crops like bitter melon or winter melon require more light, and then the ground layer crops, which were leafy crops, require less light. And so I call that a vertically layered annual polyculture to distinguish it from like woody polycultures, which are sort of the norm in agroforestry. So I've been doing some experiments the past like 3 or 4 years with this concept. So polyculture is when you combine two species in intimate association. And when you do that, you can have multiple kinds of interaction. And so facilitative and complementary interactions might be the sort of traditional three sisters, for instance, of corn or maize, beans, and squash that you probably learned about in elementary school, for instance. This was a Native American polyculture, and science has found that it actually does over yield, that you get higher yields with when you grow these three crops together than when you grow them separately in monoculture, single species plots. And that's because they have complementary root systems, they exploit different parts of the soil profile, for instance, in terms of nutrients, and they have complementary growth habits. Have competition, like weeds, for instance, growing in a cornfield. They're taking nutrients from the corn, they're reducing corn yields. This year, though, I'm trying what I'm calling a novel polyculture. So I have Tarbais beans here, and these beans are the sort of classic white bean that's used in French cassoulet. And underneath it, I'm growing sweet potatoes, but not for the leaves this time, but for the tubers. The idea is that in polycultures, you really want to evaluate whether or not they over yield by comparing yields in monoculture to yields in polyculture. And so I'm growing these, it's replicated, so there are 4 replicates, and in each replicate I have the beans growing in monoculture, the sweet potato growing in monoculture, and the 2 species growing in polyculture.
So we're looking at one in which it's monoculture beans.
Right, so we're looking at monoculture beans right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a polyculture, and you can see that the canopy hasn't really started to grow over yet, and I think that's because of the competition between the sweet potato and the beans. So it'll be interesting to see whether this system actually yields more than when we grow these 2 crops in monoculture.
Are you seeing this canopy not covering over consistently in each of the replicates of this treatment?
Yes. So in each replicate, like where we're growing this in polyculture, we're seeing that especially the middle plants, where the competition might be greatest between the sweet potato and the bean, that we're seeing like poorer growth in those middle plants. Yeah, so the sweet potato is quite lush, but this middle area, the growth of the beans is poor, like compared to the ends, and we're seeing that pattern in each of these. One thing that we might want to consider doing is that all of these are in the same irrigation system, so the monocultures and the polycultures are all getting the same amount of water. These polyculture systems may require more water. I've been noticing that the soil dries out quite quickly in these polycultures, and that's probably because we have all this lush sweet potato growth here that's taking water away from the beans. So we'll harvest these probably like in mid-October, and then we'll weigh all of the production, both the sweet potatoes and the beans from each of these plots, and then we'll crunch the numbers and we'll statistically analyze them. And often you do sort of a project like this, and then you formulate hypotheses about why what you observed happening actually happened. What are the mechanisms behind it? And then you conduct some follow-up experiments to try to tease out the actual causes. This is an NRCS funded project, Natural Resource Conservation Service funded project under a Conservation Innovation Grant. And we're collaborating with the Southside Community Land Trust on this project. And so the idea is that we've developed these urban adapted high tunnel systems. We're like comparing production within the high tunnels to production outdoors, because we know that high tunnels, are usually quite large. As Andy pointed out, these are mini high tunnels. And so they're only 14 by 32 feet in terms of their dimensions. And so they're an appropriate size for urban spaces, which are often, like quite limited in terms of area. And so the idea is that, we have these small high tunnels and we're evaluating their performance and comparing the yields that we're getting within the high tunnels to the yields in these outdoor beds. And so some of the crops that we're growing include ginger, so baby ginger, and that's over here in the front. And baby ginger can be a very lucrative crop for growers in general. I think that the price is probably about $15 a pound. We also have some turmeric in the background, in the very far left corner. And that's actually done quite well this year. It takes forever to sprout in the spring, and I don't know why, but this year we actually got it to sprout early enough that it actually attained some size. So I'm really interested in seeing how well that yields in these high tunnels. Other crops that we have growing here include roselle. So roselle is also known as sour leaf, and it's a kind of hibiscus. It's you might be more familiar with it because the calyxes, or the little sort of bracts at the base of the flowers, are used to make Redzinger tea, hibiscus tea. And so the leaves are also eaten by multiple cultural groups across the globe, like West Africa, for instance, the Caribbean. And it does have a sour taste in it. It's good, and it can be eaten in salads or cooked. We've also got this Dominican tomato variety. Other things we have okra, which likes a lot of heat too, and we have Asian eggplant. We have Cubanelle pepper. So the Cubanelle pepper, along with some of the other crops that we're growing, some of the hot peppers that we're growing, are sort of an integral part of sofrito. Not hot pepper, but rather the Capsicum chinensis, the sweet pepper, ají dulce. Sofrito, which is found in Caribbean cuisine. As I mentioned before, we are comparing yields in these high tunnels to yields outdoors. And so we want to see whether it's actually cost effective to grow plants in these urban high tunnels. And NRCS is interested in seeing whether or not they should, basically fund them and promote the development of this system, as part of their high tunnel project.
So this is, at this point, this model sort of high tunnel is not on their list of available units.
Well, you can actually, the high tunnel itself is. This 14 by 32 high tunnel. Although it is actually like these had to be from an approved vendor and an approved model. And so this 14 by 32 is already on their list. But we wanted to see whether it should be promoted and whether the idea of like this high tunnel system should be promoted, like with, for instance, growing the plants in the compost in the raised beds. We've also added to this some native plant rain gardens to capture the water off of the coverings. And so the coverings do shed water, and storm water is a big concern in urban areas because that storm water ends up in storm sewers and it carries pollutants into local waterways. And here in Rhode Island, of course, eventually into the bay. And so the idea is to capture that water as it comes off of the covering and infiltrate it into the soil while you're growing native plants that attract pollinators and might actually also be a source of income for the farmer.
What about the possibility of capturing that water for use inside the tunnel since it's not open to rainfall?
Right, sure. So no, that is definitely an option, and something that I think we're going to do this fall is add some rain gutters, some gutters to capture water. One of the issues though is sure you can capture that in a rain barrel, but then how do you actually, because you're using a drip irrigation system.
There's got to be a way.
Then you have to have a pump.
Yeah.
Probably
but
sort of
what
a pressurized vessel to
But a key issue in the urban garden setting is that the water they use is metered.
Right, yeah, so water can be a limitation in urban areas.
And we never want for growers, we never want water to be a limitation.
Right.
Not around
It can
here.
be expensive, right?
Yeah.
And it's a waste of a resource too.
And what about, you alluded to the beds and what the material that's in the beds. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So it is like Rhode Island Resource Recovery Center compost, and it does actually see, we didn't fertilize this year. Last year we did have to apply some fertilizer because the growth of the plants was rather poor. This year you can see that the plants are growing really lushly, probably because of the breakdown of the material. Now it has sort of subsided over time, and so the depth is much less than what it was when we started. So these beds were actually full to the top, and I think the level has probably dropped a good 4 or 5 inches actually at this point.
Okay.
So I think we can see that it'll probably continue to break down over time. Okay, so now here we're in my third experiment that I'm running, and I've run this for the past 4 years. And so this is what I call the systems trial. And it's a trial of small-scale intensive vegetable and cut flower production systems appropriate again for urban agriculture. So we have 4 different systems which differ in terms of their nutrient source and also tillage. So we have a conventional system which relies on synthetic mineral fertilizers and also conventional tillage with a rototiller. Then we have a precision organic system which uses organic certified or organic approved fertilizers, and we actually apply side dressing. We side dress the crops during the growing season based on the nitrogen status of the crops using a meter which measures the chlorophyll concentration of the leaves, which is a measure of the nitrogen status of the plant. We also have a system which is a compost-only system. And so that system uses only Rhode Island Resource Recovery Center compost, this yard waste compost, as a nutrient source. And that's a no-till or a minimal till system. And so we're just using a broad fork basically to aerate the soil. And then finally in the fourth system, it's an urban cap and fill system. It replicates that cap and fill system that's often used in urban agriculture. So we put down a landscape fabric initially, a special landscape fabric that doesn't allow roots to penetrate into the soil below or contaminated soil particles to migrate up into this compost soil mix, which we place on top of that landscape fabric. And so obviously we don't have contaminated soil here at the Agronomy farm, but often in urban settings, soils are contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals, or sometimes organic compounds. And so you can't actually grow in the soil. Instead, you grow in that urban cap and fill system in a compost soil mix on top of that landscape fabric. Basically, we're growing, at this point, 15 vegetable crops in rotation in each of these plots. And we are growing also 6 different cut flower crops too. Yeah, so these do provide multiple ecosystem services. So they are beautiful, obviously, and so they do make what's a very functional landscape more attractive. And that can be a concern in urban agriculture. If you're doing this in your front yard or your backyard, you might want to enrich it with flowers so that it's more appealing to passers-by. And it does attract pollinators and potentially insect predators too, so it does provide habitat for those beneficial organisms. And so we're comparing both yields across these different systems and also soil quality too. And so found that these systems, like all of the systems, can be highly productive, and in fact much more productive than some conventional field systems in Rhode Island, for instance.
On a what, square footage basis?
Yeah, on a square footage basis or a square meter basis.
Oh, excuse me.
Since we're scientists, right?
Yeah, right.
Kilograms per square meter
Okay.
basis. And obviously those two things aren't directly comparable, but it does demonstrate that these systems can be highly productive. So there have been very few actual peer-reviewed studies of the production at this scale. And so that's one of the contributions of this study. And some claims are quite extravagant in terms of, for instance, biodynamic agriculture or bio-intensive agriculture. But we're finding that, These plots are more productive than conventional farms. They're more productive than typical backyard gardens based on observational studies, but less productive than the extravagant claims I think made for bio-intensive production. The compost-only system is more productive than you might imagine. It could be or would be compared to the conventional system, for instance. The precision organic system is sometimes more productive for certain crops than the conventional system, which is sort of the standard or the control system that we're using out here. We're seeing some interesting, because we're adding compost to the compost-only system at the rate that's recommended in urban agriculture by many urban agriculture service providers of 1 inch of compost per year. We're seeing an improvement in soil quality, basically, as measured by infiltration rates for water, for instance, and soil bulk density.
Okay.
I wanted a diverse mix of crops, and I wanted to grow sort of popular crops. Widely consumed crops in these plots, as opposed to the crops that I'm growing in the NRCS high tunnels, which are very culture specific. That is sort of one thing that you do have diseases carrying over, and of course these tomatoes will next year, if I were to run this again, would be planted in the adjacent plot, and inevitably there's going to be some inoculum in the soil.
No, this is fantastic. John, thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
I think everybody's going to enjoy this.
All right.